Anton, in his introduction, referred to the fact that in the month of March, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the revelation of the last of the 14 tablets that constitute the tablets of the divine plan. I think it's interesting that today, by coincidence, the 26th of March, 2017, it's 101 years exactly from the time when Abdu'l-Bahá, in his house, in the room in his house in Baji, took up his pen and addressed the believers of the 9 northeastern states of the United States: Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Vermont, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. He addressed them as, "O ye heavenly heralds," and set in motion his divine plan for the promulgation of the faith throughout the world. So exactly 101 years ago, the Master began this process. In the sessions today, what I'd like to do in the first session is to focus on the historical context. What was happening in the world at the time that Abdu'l-Bahá revealed these tablets? And what was the impact that the revelation or the unveiling of these tablets had on the very small Baha'i community that existed in that time? And then in the session, the second session, I want to pick up on some of the themes that Ruha anticipated in her introduction, where we look at what some of the processes were that were set in motion by the tablets of the divine plan that continue to impact our work today and will take us to the fringes of the golden age of the faith. So first of all, we're looking at we're sort of going back to the years immediately prior to the First World War, and then looking at the content and the structure of Abdu'l-Bahā's tablets, and then their impact on the Baha'i community, their initial impact. Okay, so Abdu'l-Bahá was in the 74th year of his life when he addressed the Baha'is in North America in 1916 and 1917, the 14 letters which, taken together, constitute the tablets of the divine plan. These tablets, we know, represent the supreme charter for the diffusion of the faith and fashion in broad outline Abdu'l-Bahā's master plan for the spiritual regeneration of the world. They describe in really visionary terms a strategic approach to promoting the influence of the faith throughout the globe. The tablets were written during the darkest days of the First World War, at a time when communication between Abdu'l-Bahá and the Baha'i community was interrupted and for a certain period of time actually severed. There was no possibility of communicating because of naval blockades and the influence of the war. It's interesting to note that Abdu'l-Bahá had a keen interest in world events. He was an astute observer of world events, and that he clearly predicted the war. We know from the talks that he gave in his travels in the West that he referred to the possibility of the outbreak of war in Europe. He not only anticipated the war, but in one of his talks in California, he actually predicted that it would break out within 2 years. So he was speaking in 1912, and within 2 years, as he predicted, the war broke out. Against this background of predicting the war, what the Master did was emphasize the urgent need for reconciliation and the paramount importance of international peace as a means of alleviating the sufferings of humankind and the preservation of civilized values. So he not only said there's going to be a war, but he indicated what needed to be done in order to address that situation. For example, in one of his talks in California, he said, "The European continent is like an arsenal, a storehouse of explosives ready for ignition, and one spark will set the whole of Europe aflame, particularly at this time when the Balkan question is before the world." He knew in detail what was happening in the world, the rise of Balkan nationalism, the tensions between the various countries in Europe and their attempts to get allies to support their particular view. He was aware of what was happening in the world. So he sets this out, and then he says, therefore, the greatest need in the world today is international peace. The time is ripe. It's time for the abolition of warfare, the unification of nations and governments. It's time for love. It's time for cementing together the East and the West. Abdu'l-Bahá returned to Haifa after his travels, and within a period of 8 months after his arrival back in the Holy Land, the World War I broke out. And we know what some of the precipitating events were: the assassination of the Austrian Archduke in Sarajevo, and the dividing of Europe into rival camps by a system of alliances. And there were a lot of different issues, and historians like to argue about what the actual causes were. Abdu'l-Bahá, the Guardian tells us, was greatly saddened by the failure of the world to respond to the call for universal peace that was set out in the writings of Baha'u'llah and in the urgent appeals that Abdu'l-Bahá himself had uttered in his public addresses in the West. Shoghi Effendi describes the feelings of Abdu'l-Bahá in those days. He says, the Guardian said, agony filled his soul at the spectacle of human slaughter precipitated through humanity's failure to respond to the summons he'd issued or to heed the warnings he'd given. The agony filled his soul. He was so upset, so frustrated, so in despair about what was happening. The individual tablets, which constitute the tablets of the Divine Plan, were revealed in 2 separate points in time, approximately 1 year apart. The first group of 8 tablets was revealed between the 26th of March and the 22nd of April in 1916. So the end of the Nowruz period to the very beginning of Rizwan in the year 1916. and the second group were written between the 2nd of February and the 8th of March, 1917. Only 5 of the original tablets written in 1916 reached North America before the interruption of communications with Abdu'l-Bahá. And all of the other tablets were put into a safe in the Shrine of the Bab on Mount Carmel and kept there until the end of the war, when they could be sent to North America. And I think it's quite interesting to reflect on the fact that these tablets were considered so critical and so important that the master put them in a safe. And that safe was in the Shrine of the Bab. To me, it's an indication of their importance and their significance and his determination that they be held in a safe place because of their importance and the impact that they'd have on the world. The period in which the tablets of the Divine Plan were written coincide with the time of most intense suffering occasioned by the war. And the historian Amin Banani commented on the timing of the revelation of these tablets and their visionary nature. He wrote, Banani wrote, "History records this period as one of awesome bloodletting in Europe. It is truly breathtaking to contemplate the devising of the divine strategy for the redemption of the planet in the midst of the din and destruction of the old order. The transforming vision of Abdu'l-Bahá spreads before us the plans for the spiritual conquest of the globe." So this contradiction, this point in time when the old world is really being blown apart, this is the time when the Master spreads out a plan for the spiritual conquest of the planet. Okay, so what was happening in 1916? 1916, in relation to the war. 1916, the year 1916, marked the beginning of the renewed offensive on the Western Front and the commencement of the tremendous bombardments that would characterize all of the military encounters. At the beginning of 1916, you find the gathering or the assembling of huge armies confronting each other, and especially in Belgium and northern France. So just before the battle for Verdun, which began in February of 1916 and which lasted for 4 months, before this battle, a grand total of 139 divisions, 38 of which were British, 95 French, assembled, and they confronted some 117 German divisions. Now, if you Wikipedia, you go and you find out how many people are in a division, it's somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 people. So we're talking about more than 1 million people confronting each other in a very confined space and engaging in the most awful kind of war. This battle for Verdun, which began on the 21st of February and ended by the end of June. Historians say that when the fighting died away, the French had lost 315,000 casualties, and the Germans 281,000. So more than 500,000 men died in this 4-month battle. The first 8 tablets, those written between the 26th of March and the 22nd of April 1916, were actually written during the period of this battle for Verdun. And I mean, it's fascinating to see the references to war and to just, well, there's at the end of the 8th tablet, which was the last in that period, there's the most stunning prayer. It shocks me every time I read it. And let me just read you the first paragraph of that prayer. O God, my God, thou seest how black darkness is enshrouding all regions, how all countries are burning with the flame of dissension, and the fire of war and carnage is blazing throughout the east and the west. Blood is flowing, corpses bestew the ground, and severed heads are fallen on the dust of the battlefield. I mean, it's shocking. It's really shocking. And there are other images that I find equally as shocking in this long prayer that the Master wrote during that period of time. Okay. In 1916 didn't end with the battle for Verdun. There was the 20-week battle that took place along the Somme, the River Somme, and again, the casualties were absolutely catastrophic. At the outset of that battle, on the first day of the military engagement, the British sustained 60,000 casualties, 20,000 of them killed. And this was the heaviest toll sustained in a single day by any army in the First World War. So again, it was a period of slaughter and that was tearing the world apart. There were also sea battles that involved submarines, and the submarine warfare began to interfere with all kinds of shipping, including commercial shipping and trade, and this intensified the suffering of the civilian populations of Europe and brought England to its knees. And then finally, in January of 1917, the submarine warfare increased, and even civilian ships and ships from neutral countries were subject to be sunk if they ventured into a certain part of the Atlantic. It was around this time. Well, it was this. It was in April of 2016. America entered the war after a number of its ships were sunk, and up to that point, the U.S. had been neutral and not involved, and in fact had been trying to mediate and to bring the two sides together, but it failed. And so America entered the war. The final 6 tablets, those that were written between the 2nd of February and the 8th of March 1917, they were written just prior to the entry of the United States into the war. The war finally ended in November of 1918, and the world sort of took a collective deep breath and had high anticipation and hopes that the world could live in peace and that everything could get smoothed out. The Baha'is shared in this anticipation of a period of peace. And one of the things that the end of the war resulted in was that Abdu'l-Bahá was now able to communicate with the Baha'is in the West. The military blockades were over and the mail was flowing again. And so the first thing he did was make a plan to ensure the delivery to the US to North America of the remaining tablets of the divine plan. And he sent an emissary who had one of his secretaries who'd been living in the Holy Land during the period of the war to North America with these tablets, with the instructions to translate them and to be there in time for the Baha'i National Convention, which was to take place in New York at Rizwan period 1919. So that's on the Baha'i front. The Baha'is were getting ready for their national convention. At the same time, the world was also having a conference. And this was the peace conference that was called for Paris, the Paris Peace Conference, where the ambassadors and the politicians were gathering with a view to deciding what to do now that hostilities had ceased. Initially there was hope, but after a period of time, the old rivalries began to re-emerge and the desire for revenge became very strong. And one of the positive things that did emerge was the formation of the League of Nations, which was very visionary, but hamstrung right from the outset because of politics. And if you're interested in the League of Nations, I suggest that you look at the World Order Letters of Shoghi Effendi, where Shoghi Effendi assesses the significance of the establishment of the League of Nations and assesses its strengths and potential weaknesses. Okay, so there were two conferences going on. The one in Paris, which led to the Treaty of Versailles and the emergence of the League of Nations, and also the conference in New York of the Baha'is. And in reading the reports of the conference in New York, one has the impression, I get the impression, that the Baha'is were aware of this interesting connection in time between these two events, between the gathering of the leaders of the political world who were trying to sort out what to do with Europe, what to do with reviving the world after the war. And the Baha'is gathered in New York who were given this visionary plan for the transformation of the planet. And let me just quote from one of the speeches that was given at this conference. The speaker said, "At precisely the moment in human history when an unprecedented outbreak of violence had undermined..." Oh, excuse me, that's the wrong one. That was a comment from... Sorry. Yeah. The fact that while we were gathering, discussing plans for spiritual union and harmony throughout the world, the delegates at Paris in the peace conference were meeting to establish the new world conditions, politically, economically, and socially. It lent a peculiar power and significance to the gathering of the friends in the metropolis of the new world. So that there was awareness of, there's the political side of things that people are trying to figure out, and here we are trying to discussing plans for spiritual union and harmony throughout the world. Okay, let's project forward, or back, I guess it's back to 1919, and imagine that you're sitting in the Hotel McAlpin in New York City on between the 26th and the 30th of April in 1919, and you've been invited to the National Convention, and you know that there are tablets that Abdu'l-Bahá has sent to this convention, and everybody's been encouraged to come. What are you feeling? What are you feeling? I mean, excitement, the sort of what's going to happen. Well, let's see. Okay, it was a convention where the presence of Abdu'l-Bahá where people were aware of his presence. He sent cables to the conference, and in one of them he instructed, "Let this be the convention of the covenant." So he's winding up the sense of expectation, helping people see the real significance of the gathering. The convention began with a reception and the celebration of the Feast of Rizwan, and it was attended by some 600 people, including people from the wider community, some of whom were clergymen and leaders of thought who'd met Abdu'l-Bahá during his visits to the West. I mean, it was just 7 years after the Master had been in New York and travelled throughout the country. So there, people still talked about his visit. They still told stories about his visits. It was familiar. The purpose of the conference and the hopes of this convention were laid out in one of the presentations. And let me just read you what the individual said. From the vantage point at that high mountain, Carmel, Abdu'l-Bahá, the center of the covenant of God, has turned his eyes and is looking toward the group of people to see to what extent they will respond to this tremendous call, which has come through from out of the heart of the war. Yes, farther than that, from the heart of peace and love and spirituality. The Word of God is a divine solvent. There's no other. The Word of God is a solution for the vexing problems which are facing the globe today. So it's beginning to make the connection between the teachings of the faith and the solution of the problems of society. Goes on. Everything in this Congress revolves around these divine instructions. Can you imagine what it might have meant if in the days of Jesus Christ, tremendous tablets, revelations from Christ, had been presented to the body of the Christian people? And then he goes on and answers his own question. Through the progress of the world and through the bounty of God and through the requirements of this illumined day and through the greatness of the problems themselves, just exactly that thing has happened. So in a new age, a new time, in the days of Christ it wasn't possible. In this day it is. And we are the recipients. Let us, therefore, as we approach these great unveilings, turn our hearts to God and know that we are living through the mercy of God at a time in the history of the world which is absolutely epoch-making. In no past age or cycle of which we have record did such great events transpire. Realizing this, let us in our minds and hearts prepare that at the end we shall not go away from these sessions without a definite plan of action, which shall spread the bounties of God to every last individual on the face of the globe. So at the beginning of this event, the chair was highlighting the importance of the historical moment, the significance of this particular point in time, the crucial nature of this point in time, and the responsibility of the believers to arise to play their part in bringing about the kinds of conditions in the world that were now required. May Maxwell then got up and spoke. And I think what she did was she highlighted the supreme challenge confronting the friends who were gathered in that meeting. She began by reflecting on the history of religion, the distinguished services of the apostles, the disciples of Christ. And then she cautioned about the danger of failing to appreciate the true significance of the present moment. Got to be careful not to overlook the significance of the present moment. We can often, we only understand the significance of the present when we look back. We look back into the past periods in the world, and we realize the greatness or the importance of that time. And she observed, it may be that the most difficult thing for the soul is to become conscious of the greatness of events with which we are contemporaneous, the greatness of events that are happening here and now. Okay, I read through all these reports. They're all published in the 1916, 1918, 1920, around there, in the Star of the West. It's all published. But I found it quite fascinating to ponder the speeches that were given, because it seemed to me I could feel the growing realization of this group of friends who'd come to learn about the contents of these tablets, there was this growing of awareness of a moment in history and the kind of responsibility that accompanied the bounty of being alive in that moment in history. Okay, let me just give you a couple of examples from these talks. I think many of them address the current state of the world and the fundamental changes that had resulted from that were resulting from the recently concluded war. And this awareness, I think, influenced people's perceptions, their reflections, and the like. For example, one person said, "Most everyone feels that we are today standing on the threshold of an age of material and intellectual and spiritual regeneration. All the hidden forces of humanity are being stirred. Political, social, and economic principles of the last 2 generations are more or less set at naught, and the wise men of every nation are thinking to reconstruct the body politic from top to bottom." So people were conscious that there were changes, that the events in the world were forcing people to look at things in a fresh way, in a different way. And another speaker said, "You know, we're living in such an astounding day of tumult and endeavour, a day when all the old world is absolutely falling to pieces, that sometimes we're in despair. Sometimes we say, how can this great edifice lift its head out of this ruin and catch the light of the sun once more?" I mean, it could have been written today. It could have been written yesterday. And the state of the world in contemporary times is in such chaos that questions such as these are being raised everywhere. I think the awareness of this historical moment, that I take from my reading of these speeches, I think it extended to the conviction that the advent of Baha'u'llah and the teachings of the faith provided the remedy for the issues facing contemporary society, and that the guidance contained in the tablets of the Divine Plan was critical to effecting the necessary regeneration of human society. So the Friends went beyond just looking at the state of the world and seeing the struggle to identify new ways of doing things, to seeing, our teachings really can make a major contribution to the regeneration of the planet. Okay. Associated with an understanding of the needs of contemporary society was, I think, a growing realization of the nature and scope of the spiritual enterprise to which the Baha'is were being called, and the heavy responsibility they were being asked to accept. Okay, another couple of examples. In the words of one of those who addressed the gathering, the challenge confronting the Baha'is was to convey the vision of the new age to the peoples of the world. And here's the quote: "To fill the hearts with the new ideals of God, love, beauty, constancy, and happiness, as portrayed in the writings of Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Bahá. This means that we're called upon to solve some of the most crucial problems of this age. In order to render this service, we must not lag behind, but be in the vanguard of the forces of this new ideal civilization. We must universalize our aims, spiritualize our thoughts, renew our beings, exalt our ambitions, and dedicate ourselves to the service of humanity. So it's, again, this growing awareness, the sense of responsibility, the scope of what needed to be done. Associated with that was, I think, also the dawning awareness that you weren't going to do it in a day or a week or one cycle. And one of the speakers said, it's not the work of 1 or 2 or 10 or 20 years, but for a long stretch of years. It is indeed a divine responsibility. So there was awareness that we're in this for the long term, that what Abdu'l-Bahá was calling upon the believers to do was to make a fundamental change in society, and that this would be a process, an enterprise that would go on and on and on. And as Ruha quoted one of the statements of a recent House of Justice message, that will take us to the fringes of the golden age. It's a long way into the future, but it's so important. By the last session of the convention, the participants were galvanized, they were thrilled, they were ready to go, and they I think they had a realization that what they were being asked to do was to establish the kingdom of God on earth. And many of the speeches picked up on that theme. Okay, now I think I want to stop. We know that at that convention itself, already people were saying, I'll do this, I'll do this, I'll do this, I'll do something else. And then at the next national convention in 1920, a national teaching committee was established, and regional committees, and individual believers arose to begin to implement some of the international goals of the faith, including Martha Root, who never even went home after attending the convention in New York, but stayed in New York and hopped on a ship and went to the first of her travels in South America and visiting some of the priority places that were specified by Abdu'l-Bahá in the tablets on this first travel. One of the things I forgot to do was to mention a little bit about the structure of the book. It's about 100, if you take out the introduction and all the indexes at the back, it's just over 100 pages, about 106 pages, small pages. And there are, of the first 8 tablets that were revealed in 1916, there was one each to 5 different regions in North America, regions that were designated by Abdu'l-Bahá. The northeastern states, the southern states, the central states, the western states, and the other region was Canada and Greenland. Interesting. Think about that. Canada and Greenland. So that was the 5 of the first 8. And then the other three tablets of that first 8 the tablets were addressed collectively to the Bahá'ís of the United States and Canada. And it was in the ones to the United States and Canada where Abdu'l-Bahá assigned the, if you will, external goals. The first 5, they were kind of home front within the regions, but the others, in the first of the collective tablets, he called upon the Baha'is to take the faith to the Western Hemisphere, in other words, to North and South America. In the second of the tablets, it was to the rest of the world, to all of the continents, the 5 continents, and even to the islands of the Pacific. And then in the last of those collective tablets, he addresses the believers as, "O ye apostles of Baha'u'l-Abhá," and he invites us all to become an apostle of Baha'u'llah, and he sets out the conditions that need to be fulfilled in order for us to attain to that station, and we'll talk about that in the second talk. Okay, the second group of 6 tablets, the remaining 6 tablets, again, there was one each to the 5 regions that I mentioned before, and it was basically a reiteration of the guidance, plus he includes a prayer for each of the regions, the 5 regions. And then the final tablet was relates, in my view, to sort of the role of religion in society, and what it is in a society that brings people together. And then he also reiterates the importance of taking the faith to the Western Hemisphere. So he goes back to teaching within North and South America. And with all of the tablets addressed collectively, the 4 of them collectively to the United States and Canada, each one is concluded with a prayer. So there are 9 prayers and 14 tablets.